very much, Barbara. Julian, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Ireland and look forward to hearing your remarks. And I'd like to congratulate Marion, firstly, on an excellent speech. I found myself nodding furiously. But also, and I think probably more importantly, on her re-election to the European Parliament, because we really need committed, competent, hard-working MEPs such as yourself. And I'm just delighted that you were returned to the Parliament and wish you the very best for the next 5 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I can only apologise that for many of you, you have to listen to me twice. So I think Joe and I are going to have to enter into a pact that I won't come back to Glenties for a few years to allow everybody to recover. But it's a pleasure. It's great to have a chance to talk about some of these issues because obviously the European question is one that maybe doesn't exercise all of us in our sleep at night, but it is one that challenges each and every citizen, not just in Ireland but across the continent, and it's one that is of such vital importance to all of us. The preamble to this session, which Barbara alluded to, it begs the question, can the dream of all the nations of Europe, from the Atlantic to the Urals, living together in peace, harmony, freedom and prosperity, whilst keeping their own languages and cultural identity, be kept alive? And my short answer to this is yes, it can, but the vision can no longer be taken as either likely or as being guaranteed. So we have a lot of work to do. The European dream is clearly under enormous pressure, but it is worth fighting for. It's worth fighting for many reasons, but it can be distilled down into two major ones. Firstly, the horror that came before the European project was conceived, and I don't need to give you history lessons to talk about the devastation in the First and Second World Wars, but also what is likely to unfold if the European project, the European dream, is shattered. I certainly reject the Eurosceptic mantra that the European Union is an entity that for some inexplicable reason is determined to undermine our rights, steal our sovereignty and coerce us into monocultural uniformity. This is utter nonsense, frankly. The EU is a structure. It's nothing more and it's nothing less. It's an institution which is designed to facilitate the coming together of European nations so that they can cooperate on a range of issues in an environment that is based on clear rules that all must adhere to. That is the purpose of the European Union as an entity. And like all institutions, the EU gets many things wrong. However, its shortcomings do not warrant the visceral criticism that we hear so often. We should seek to reform, to improve our union, but not to break it, as is the stated objective of many people who are now sitting as elected representatives in the European Parliament. It's an entity that has taken decades to build, and whether we like to admit it or not, it has brought peace and prosperity to hundreds of millions of Europeans since the middle of the last century. We wanted to do more, there's no doubt about it, but it has seen major achievements and major success, and we have benefited from them here in this country. There's no doubt that the complexity of the institution has meant that the Union has lost its romantic appeal in recent years, or at least has failed abjectly to communicate it. It's more synonymous with directives and regulations than the coming together of people in pursuit of their shared future. Such a vision is very difficult to articulate, and it's even more difficult to communicate to the masses. It is undoubtedly much easier to attack the European Union and all of its bizarre and complex elements than to actually try to explain it and advocate for its existence. One prominent Irish politician often uses the line, "I love Europe, but I hate the European Union," and he invariably generates some amusement when he says that he loves French cheese and Italian wine and German efficiency, but he despises the laws and rules that emanate from Brussels. Now, we all might like, in an ideal world, to coexist in a Europe without rules. But the reality is, quite frankly, that such a Europe just would not work. The institutions, the structures, the rules are all necessary if 28 member states, and hopefully soon to be more, are to continue to work together in relative harmony. While the regulation may at times seem excessive and may very well be excessive, that is no reason to do away with the structures that allow nation states to work together. These structures provide us with the essential ground rules. So what now for the European dream? We must keep faith in the process of democracy and keep faith in European solidarity. These are obviously very difficult times, but our common resolve can and will see us through them. The nationalistic rhetoric tells us we can go it alone, that we don't need the European Union. But as a great philosopher once said, so powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. Pursuing our goals together is too powerful a force to turn our back on. As Europeans, we must reassert our common values, our principles of fairness, of democracy, of justice and equality. And these are values that bind us together. Yes, we have differences. Yes, we have competing interests. But these are the essential values that bind us together and are uniquely European. You will not find them binding the people in any other continent across the world together as tightly as they bind us as Europeans. We must cherish our citizens. We must cherish our families, our communities, and ensure that always they are what motivate and drive our politics. And maybe we have lost sight of some of that in recent years, but they have to be and continue to be the motivating factors for all that we do in the European Union and across the continent of Europe. There is a legitimate sense of frustration due to the economic crisis and due to high levels of unemployment, but we cannot succumb to apathy, to resignation, or most crucially, we cannot turn our backs on each other. The opposite is the case. We as Europeans, whether in Berlin or Dublin or Paris or Bratislava, we must have the courage to stand together and fight for a common future, and we have to do it together. What can we Irish or the British or any other European nation achieve alone in a global world? The answer is not a lot, but together we can succeed, we can work for solutions, we can face our problems. And these problems are common to all Europeans. We all face these challenges, and we have a far better prospect of overcoming them together than we do alone. That's why, and Barbara mentioned this in her introduction, that is why I find the rhetoric of the British debate on Europe so alien. When I hear Mr Farage, or indeed Mr Cameron, speak of a European Union that wishes to steal our identity and force us into some sort of uniform existence, I simply do not recognise the Europe that they speak of. They seem to create in the minds of their citizens a sort of mythical EU monster so that they can portray themselves as the saviour. They deliberately pitch the British people against the rest of Europe, when in fact our enemies lie elsewhere. It is the sort of them and us mentality that Churchill and de Gaulle and Adenauer wished to leave behind forever. The most ridiculous example of this was Mr Cameron's unprovoked and rather petty attack on Jean-Claude Juncker some weeks ago. Instead of recognising that Juncker, politically speaking, should be in fact a soulmate of Mr Cameron with his fondness, proven fondness for low taxes, for healthy competition, for support for small business, he chose to make a caricature of the man instead, differentiating the habits of Luxembourgers with those of Englishmen. Deliberate leaks to the media tried to undermine Juncker through all sorts of trivial misrepresentations rather than appraising his legacy as a Prime Minister and as a Finance Minister. The EU, as it currently exists, was built by all of its members, but it has to be said most particularly by the three largest nations, by Germany, France and the United Kingdom. And Britain's
Britain's position in Europe, its participation at the table since the foundation, can be and has been a positive force for building a genuine European democracy. Britain's critical approach to the EU often has had a galvanising effect for those who favour a strong union with shared rights and opportunities across the continent, but equally it can provide and has provided a very helpful break at times when the European Union was expanding its reach maybe too far. With the UK isolated, this positive effect has arguably been absent for quite some time. The British position on key issues like removing barriers to trade within the internal market, creating a digital single market, developing a wide-ranging free trade agreement with the United States, has not been as forceful or impactful as we might hope. This is bad news for Europe. It's bad news for Ireland. It's bad news particularly for the United Kingdom itself. Despite all of her tough talk, and Marion mentioned this, Margaret Thatcher never isolated the United Kingdom in Europe and often succeeded in shaping its direction. The opposite is happening at this point in time. Instead of pandering to the UKIP isolationist mantra, David Cameron should actually fight for a new relationship between Britain and Europe and express his clear desire for something different, whatever it may be. But the fault lines must be on actual substance, on policy, on the future direction of the Union, not on gamesmanship and petty personality politics. Instead, Cameron must appeal to the broader interest of his citizens and the Union as a whole, rather than constantly looking to the lowest common denominator and turning the hype of tabloid journalistic attacks on Europe, which his now disgraced former adviser would of course be very proud of. It's inevitable that an exit from the EU would mean that the British economy would suffer. Some 54% of all British trade is conducted with other EU countries. The total EU foreign direct investment in Britain is the equivalent of 30% of its GDP. Britain's interest lies in reducing the cost of trade with its largest partners, which the EU is currently spearheading across the world. Being outside of the tent would unquestionably result in reduced investment, reduced trade, zero influence on regulatory developments that hugely impact on its economy, whether in or out. How on earth could that be in Britain's interest? The people have been regularly misled by Eurosceptic politicians on the role that the EU plays in their lives. And this should be rebutted by the Prime Minister, who clearly understands the benefit of the European Union for his country and his people. Instead, David Cameron has stooped to the level of these populists in order to chase the votes of, admittedly, a very charismatic Nigel Farage, who consistently misleads the public with little or no opposition in the UK. Mr Cameron would be much better served by leading rather than following on Europe. And he should take note, and I mentioned it yesterday, of the extraordinary gains of Matteo Renzi in Italy, whose party won just over 40% of the vote in the recent European elections. And Renzi did this by setting out a positive vision of the EU and his country's place in the Union, rather than by succumbing to negative Eurosceptic talk. Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And there was never a truer word spoken when it comes to Britain's relationship with Europe. If the British people decide to vote against remaining in Europe, then both Britain and Europe will lose out. Perhaps a sea change in political leadership and the British people's perspectives on the EU will only come about when they feel the effects of economic and political isolation. I hope it doesn't come to that, but in the meantime, Europe cannot afford to ignore Britain's issues, but equally it should only engage on the substance of their concerns and not be drawn into a personality bunfight, as was attempted in the Juncker case. Europe acting cohesively and moving forward on issues of trade and the global economy is the single best way to demonstrate the benefits of a stronger and closer union, not just to the British people, but to the people of the whole of the European Union. I've obviously spoken a lot about Britain, but I'm also obviously deeply conscious of the Irish concerns that exist in respect of the Union. We have very conveniently blamed the EU for many of our problems in recent years, and this certainly suits the parties that were in government, particularly in 2008. The debate has shifted from the extraordinary flawed policy decisions of the 2000s, which led to a catastrophic property and banking collapse, and now largely ignores the fact that the financial regulator led bankers into reckless lending practices that brought down at least one of our banks. And it now seems to focus almost entirely on blaming Mr Trichet and the ECB for our woes. While there is no doubt that the ECB exerted undue pressure on Ireland and that our European partners do now need to recognise this by easing our debt burden, there should be no escaping the truth that bad policy making and bad politics were the primary reasons for Ireland's economic and financial failure in 2008. We have paid an enormous price because of this. Even this government has decided that it is politically expedient to take credit for the good news stories and blame Europe for the bad. When difficult budgets were brought in over the past few years, all of the difficult measures were blamed on the EU-IMF troika. Property tax, cuts to people with disabilities, reductions in classroom supports were all blamed on Europe. Never was it acknowledged that while the targets and parameters were set by the EU and IMF as our international lenders, the choices that were made were ours and ours alone. In other words, the decisions to cut the provision of carers or the removal of medical cards from the sick were domestic choices that might just as easily have been there might just as easily have been a more appropriate decision, for example, to cut the number of administrators in the health service, but that would have been politically more difficult. That was the calculation that was made. These were political choices domestically taken, which had little to do with Europe, yet Europe seems to get the blame. When there was a good news story, on the other hand, in the form of the country's exit from the bailout programme, the government wanted to take all the credit for itself. Such was the potential for backslapping amongst senior government figures that the European Commissioner responsible for the programme, Mr Olli Rehn, was told he wouldn't be welcome in Dublin for the celebrations. The image of a senior European Commissioner was certainly not wanted to muddy the euphoric, self-satisfied waters. This was cynical in the extreme. All of this reinforces the false view that Europe is bad and narrow nationalism is good. We need to challenge this because it's lazy, it's cynical, and it suits certain interests. No doubt, there is absolutely no doubt, that Europe must reform. It must be more responsive, more transparent, more open and connected with its citizens. We must build a new vision of Europe which all of its citizens can support, but the very first step must be to challenge the negativity and the lies that certain national politicians propagate for their own cynical purposes. We should no longer tolerate the bitter, resentful and untrue description of a union that simply does not exist. Only then can we begin the task of delivering a European Union that is fit for the global challenges we face together. Thank you very much.